There we are. Now I'm so loud that I heard us over David's speaker.
Yeah, I thank David. We have David Thompson with us today, the most handsome war game Euro / designer we have in the world.
Fit young man.
And Artie, obviously. So we got
slightly less fit.
Well, what can I say? But Dave, thanks a lot for being here, man. This is great. Our topic today, Artie, is war games that have Euro mechanics in it. So,
right.
David, you're perfect to be in this show. It's perfect. I mean, I've been asking you for what, 2 years to appear on my show, and you made room. I don't know what you did, but here we are. I'm joking.
So I want to ask what constitutes Euro mechanics, because just in the same sense that what makes a particular mechanic a war game mechanic, other than being generally associated with war games. I mean, war games have CRTs and zones of control and hex and counter and all those things, and Euros have the tile draw system, whatever that's called, and the worker placement, stuff like that. But I mean, what is that really? What makes those Euro mechanics as opposed to war game mechanics?
Like, are you asking me or are you asking the pro?
I'm asking David, because David is the resident expert this evening.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, we have to acknowledge Brant, good man there. That's a good question. I would start the entire conversation by saying that, war game, Euro game, Ameritrash game, it's hard to find like current games that are being made that are that just fit in one of those categories without some overlap, right? I mean, you can find maybe some hex and counter games that are clearly war games, but the distinction of your prototypical Euro versus Ameritrash game is gone now, right? I mean, people, as a war gamer, when you start to see anything that's outside of what you in your mind consider a war game, you're going to attribute it to something else, right?
Okay,
some outside force.
Can you tell me what is that war gamers are used to? Like, what are they?
Well, I mean,
hair.
I'm a war gamer, right? But I'm used to a much, much, much broader definition of that than other people. Right?
No, but you said what war gamers are.
Well, we can all agree. Everybody can agree that hex and counter games are war games, right? No one's ever going to debate that, right? So then you start to, well,
maybe. I mean, is Magic Realm is a hex-based game, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
There's hexes. So I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with the point. I think if we saw a hex and counter game based on a historical situation, it's almost certainly a war game, and the number of exceptions are vanishingly small.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say that there's a lot more overlap in the current Venn diagram than there used to be, right? That's probably the easiest way to look at it. Most games are straddling all sorts of different spheres now, or many games are, and it's much more common. I mean, if you ask most war gamers now, if Upfront's a war game, they probably say yes. Certainly, when it came out, it wasn't, right? If coin game, etc., right? Coin is very Euro in most people's minds. Still, most people would accept.
I would say yes.
Yeah, and I think it gets categorized that way. I don't know that I would consider it Euro, but I mean, there are one of the things that I think tends to characterize the broad things that tends to characterize Euro games as opposed to war games or Ameritrash games is the relative de-emphasis on randomized things.
Yeah.
And there are no dice in coin games, for example. Now, even a lot of Euro games, like there's a bag of tiles or whatever, there's some kind of or cards, there's some kind of randomization, even if there's no dice. Coin doesn't have dice. The only random thing happening in the game is the shuffle of the deck. So I mean, in that sense,
one really easy, really, really low hanging fruit here is the concepts of input and output randomness, right? And so, like you're talking about a deck of cards, input randomness, right? Whether you get to control it or not. And in coin, you don't really. You shuffle it and you go. And in some games, you get to control that. But most people would classify that as closer to Euro, where roll a dice to get the result of an action you decided to take, output randomness, it's much more traditionally associated with war games, Ameritrash games.
before we get to Nathaniel's like really crazy thing, coin game. Now that Volko's here, Volko, thanks. I played the Cuba Libre. I really enjoyed it, though I'm perplexed. Now, a coin game. Am I wrong to say that it's worker placement?
No, I wouldn't say that coin is
Think
worker.
about it. Think about it.
There's a kinship there in the mechanism, but I mean, I don't think anybody would actually call coin games worker placement games.
Well, no, I mean, not in the true worker placement, but think about it.
Well, I mean, you're placing dudes on a map somewhere, right? And then they do things. But what part of the worker placement is that the placement itself is the thing that does the thing.
Well,
as opposed to coin, where you put cubes down or whatever it is, and then you can later perform some kind of action with those pieces, whatever they represent, whether they're fortresses or bases or troops or whatever, what have you. I think that's the difference between traditional worker placement. But I mean, there's certainly, I mean, they're all games, right? I mean,
yeah. And here's another thing. God, I had it. Now I forgot it. Thanks, Artie.
They.
Oh no. Okay. So if Twilight Struggle is not / is a war game, then coin fits right into that.
Sure, I think most even the hardcore grognards would probably buy the statement that whatever category Twilight Struggle fits into, coin also fits into that. So, and I'll go out on a limb and say that if there is, and I've said this before, if those games, Twilight Struggle, coin, for example, among many other examples, Shores of Tripoli, for instance, if those are not war games, then I don't care particularly. I think if we get lost in the semantics of the argument, I don't think that has any particular value, and it just tends to upset people who possibly shouldn't need to become upset.
So Nathaniel's question here, Euromechanics really seems like an attempt to appease grognards who want a more limited definition of war games. No, I think
he means the terminology of Euromechanics rather than the introduction of the actual Euromechanics, whatever that means, into the actual game, though. I mean, if you're talking about war games with Euromechanics, then you're talking about games that a lot of grognards are going to whine about not being war games, right?
So, David, hold on a second here. This guy's name is unbelievable. Mr. Bendover, is Undaunted just a deck builder? I would say no.
I would say no.
I mean, it uses deck building as its core mechanic, right? I mean, versus what? Versus is it a deck builder and not a war game? Is that the implied question?
Maybe that's what he's trying to say.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I don't know. And kind of as Artie was getting, I mean, it kind of doesn't matter to me. I don't really care. You'll see. I'll see a lot of comments. People get really, really worked up about Undaunted in the ratings, and they'll write a dissertation on how it's not a war game, and I'm like, nobody said it was. Like, I don't know what we're arguing. Like, it doesn't matter to me if you think it is or not. Like, I just want people to play it and have fun.
So Bendover was saying he.
Yeah.
What a great name! I don't know.
I wonder if that could be a pseudonym.
I don't know. I want to get to know the guy, but anyways,
I'm having flashbacks to The Simpsons, right?
So you are a war gamer, right? You've played all these hex encounters, blah 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 blah, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I would definitely classify myself more in the Omni gamer who enjoys war games, right?
Right now, but your first step into Omni gaming. Did you actually think about it? Did you actually give it a thought? Like, war gamers are not going to like this, or just
no? But I mean, my first war game was probably, looking back, was probably A Few Acres of Snow, which is a quintessential Euro war game hybrid, right?
Yeah, and that was by what's
Martin Wallace.
That's Martin Wallace.
Yeah. I mean, for God's sake.
And there's a whole bunch of what I would categorize as hybrid. I mean, again, I don't want to get lost in the semantics of it here, but hybrid games like the there's a name for this series. I don't know what the name of the series is. It's like the 1775 series from Academy Games.
Yeah,
that's another example. That's a fine game, by the way. I haven't played the others in the series, but I like that one.
Yeah, Birth of America, Quartermaster General. These are games that are. Absolutely, they are war games, and they are Euros, right?
Absolutely. So. And Would you? Well, no. What would you call Risk? I guess Risk is
so. You know what's funny is somebody had asked me, Jason Perez. I don't know if you guys know Jason Perez. He's One Stop Co-op Shop. He's a really good guy. He was asking me for prep for an interview about Risk as a war game, and ironically, I don't classify Risk as a war game.
I don't think of it as.
It's a troops on a map game, but it has no foundation in reality. When you're playing it, it's a negative lessons learned, right? Like you're not learning. There's no geography. There's nothing. I mean, the only thing you might take away from it is like troop ratio.
But Ukraine is so big.
Yeah.
It's the only reason I know the names Kamchatka and Irkutsk.
Look, I mean, Volko says here that Mark Herman, when he put out We the People, he got lambasted. So
well, yeah, and that's a good point. If I'm willing to defer to Mark on this particular question. So here's something that a factoid I just uncovered yesterday, by the way, that if they don't know it already, will enrage fusty old grognards everywhere. Risk now has an Avalon Hill logo on the box.
Hold on, wasn't that Milton Bradley?
Parker Brothers, I thought.
So they bought Parker Brothers now?
They've owned Parker Brothers the whole time.
Forever, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a strategic thing. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is they put Risk, because there's cannon on the box. They put it in with the Avalon Hill stuff, right? So I mean, the Avalon Hill brand is now managed directly under Hasbro. It's no longer under Wizards of the Coast as of earlier this year. So, and Wizards of the Coast, at least to some extent, was like run by people who play games, right? Hasbro, I have no idea, and my guess would be no.
So
Wizards of the Coast puts out, like in the D&D line, there's some good, like Lords of Waterdeep. They put out quality stuff, right?
I love Lords of Waterdeep. I think it's a fantastic game.
Hey, this is a war game show. Come on, you blast me.
Hey, one thing just occurred to me. There's somewhere in the world right now, probably in Germany, there's 3 dudes that are Eurogamers talking about how the definition of Eurogames has expanded, right? Because, 15 years ago, every single Euro was super drab cover with a old white dude kind of, dour looking at it, and really, like Artie, like you were saying, very little randomness and stuff. So as we think through our hobby, the definition of what is a war game expanding and the hybridization and stuff, it's happening in the other places too, obviously.
Yes, and it's more exciting there because it's being shouted in German.
That's true.
I agree with what Carl is saying. Absolutely. It makes the game easier. For a guy like me, it makes the game easier because, I'm not as smart and beautiful as you guys. I'm just saying, And, I think it's fantastic.
So I'd be really curious to go back and look at. Doug Sunset has mentioned Empires of the Middle Ages, which I think is a late 70s game, 1980 maybe. It might even be 81, but it can't be later than 81 because January of 82 is when SPI went away. I would be curious to know if the consensus at the time among hobbyists was that the dividing lines between things like war games and non-war games, because we didn't have the concept of Euros at the time, but we certainly had war games and not war games, was really anywhere near as firm as it is now. If we've sort of greatly ghettoized those genres over the last, say, 20 or 30 years, I suspect that we have. That's a phenomenon that one sees in literature, for example. There didn't used to be a hard dividing line between fantasy and science fiction, right? It was all kind of just weird fiction. And that distinction kind of something that arose starting in maybe the 40s and kind of firmed up as we worked our way into like the 80s and stuff like that. And now we kind of think of them as 2 separate genres. Me too, right? But they all used to get published in the same magazines, right? Weird Tales published all that stuff. They published everything from Robert E. Howard to James Blish, which we would consider like archetypical fantasy and archetypical science fiction nowadays. There wasn't that firm notion of this is this one thing and this is this other thing. So, I mean, that's what I mean when I think a lot of what we're engaging in when we have that discussion of this is in this category and this is in this category. Those labels might be useful. They might tell us something, but I am reluctant to get too bound up in them because I think we risk losing sight of what information is being conveyed by that terminology. It just in the sense of, prescriptive Puritanism.
Artie, just for me, can you make a distinction between war game mechanics and Euro game mechanics? Very cut and dry there.
See, I don't know that I can necessarily. I could certainly say these three things, like I already did, are traditionally associated with Euro games, and these other things are traditionally associated with war games. So I can give you examples, and I might be able to lay out some broad principles. Like in a war game, there tends to be some kind of a proportional relationship between the game space as depicted on the game board or map and some piece of historical geography, whether it's the Eurasia or the battlefield at the Somme, for example. So I think we could, but I find it very difficult to pin that down, and that's why we continue to have these arguments. Well, again, that's just an example, right? CRTs are a war game thing, right?
What about chit pulling? Is that war game mechanic?
I say chit pull is being used on both sides of that particular divide, right? There's
Herman Lettman.
Carcassonne, you're pulling chits out of a bag, as I recall. So isn't that chit pull? How is that not? Why is it not chit pull?
No, that's chit pull. That's chit
right.
Pull.
So I mean, yeah, they're big chits, but who cares?
So David, you don't think about all this, the flack you're going to get, or the adulation you're going to get when you're designing a game concerning whatever. If you pull out a war game and there's cards in it and there's tiles to be placed.
David starts to get upset about it, but then a dump truck full of money backs up to his front door.
I'm just swimming in it.
It dumps it into the swimming pool.
It's like it's in pennies though. It's in pennies. No, so somebody had commented earlier about Euro games modernizing mechanics and stuff, and I don't think the intent was this, but what we don't want anybody is to infer that we're saying that Euro games have these more modern mechanisms that are the quote unquote right way that we're supposed to go, et cetera. Right. So I would just say that obviously there's 48,000 ways you can approach any game design, right? You could choose all sorts of, I was just looking the other day at some of the most recent Bulge games. There's a couple of really light ones that came out and include John Butterfield's board game adaptation of his video game, and it's super light. And I was just thinking through like all the different permutations of Battle of the Bulge, and you could do it so many different ways, and there's just not a right or wrong. Well, I mean, I have an entire shelf of French and Indian war games, and every single one of them has radically different mechanisms, from Volko's, CDGs to the Birth of America series and they're just all very different. And so I think it's what you're trying to model, what you're trying to achieve, and what fits best for it, right? And to say that something's better than another is just...
So, well, in your opinion, who succeeded the most in terms of mechanics in one of those French and Indian war games?
They're all trying to tell very different things, right? Very different things. So if you're trying to talk about, Fog of War, maybe it's that new Worthington, I think, block war game that just came out recently. It's really fun, super fun. Probably my favorite mechanism in the world is simultaneous action resolution, right? Which that game has simultaneous orders. If your goal, like the Birth of America series, is to have a family weight, game that people can jump into and have a team experience, then the 1754 Conquest is the best. So it depends on your goal. It depends on what the intent was.
And you play a lot of games with your children, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And have you ever tried to make them play a hardcore war game?
They play, but this is funny. So I have three. I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old daughter, and I have my 7-year-old son. And the only quote unquote war game that they've played probably is By Stealth and Sea, the game I designed. And my son and my middle daughter love it. It's probably because it's co-op. It's also super, it's light, low complexity. Yeah. But it's co-op, so we can play it together, right?
Right.
I've never tried to introduce them. I don't try to push anything on them. I kind of introduce them to it, and hey, whatever they want to do is what we do.
I got an extra copy of Guderian Splitzkrieg too.
We're gonna drive over to Columbus.
David, with all the money you're making right now, thank you for sending me the loads of cash and writing writing a piece of music that you wanted on your stuff. This is just different stuff here. Hold on a second. I know you wanted a piece of music in a video, so here it is. I'm handsome and you're ugly and you know it. I'm handsome and you're ugly and you know it. I wake up in the morning and I look into the mirror. I'm handsome and you're ugly and you know it. So there it is, Dave. Thanks for the money. I appreciate it. And you got your video.
Wow.
Wow is exactly what I was going to say.
Ooh, wow. Oh, man.
Hey, look, I'm unemployed. What do you want? I got time.
It's a good thing I showed up tonight because that would have been awkward if I hadn't.
Yeah. People be DMing him on Twitter. Oh, you got to watch the show and see what they did.
And look, Bend Over is the first guy to give us class.
Well, as long as we have good old Ben's approval, it's all going to be okay.
So what were we talking about?
I don't remember now.
But Euro games and Euro mechanics in war games. What about war game mechanics in Euro games?
Something I want. Let me say this before I address that question. So I'll give you the chance to forget the question so you can ask it again. I think it's harder now to sort of exist in a little silo of game design I experienced this most closely with RPGs where you kind of kept seeing the same guy, not necessarily the same people, but the same ideas getting recycled of people trying to redo D&D. It's like D&D, except it's got 15 classes instead of 9, or it's got skills, all these other things, because that's what the designers were familiar with. They existed in this bubble, and they weren't really that well exposed to things outside that bubble. I think because of the internet, because of YouTube and places like Board Game Geek and stuff like that, it's a little harder to be quite that sheltered. So I think that regardless of how many wargame mechanics have popped up in Euros, and I can't think of any, other than the kinds of games that we've mentioned where I would consider them just war games, I think there's a bigger pool and a more designers and potential designers are aware of the different types of tools that they have to work with in that larger pool. And the pool's not necessarily larger, but it's more visible because of the internet.
Doug, I think is saying something. Empires of the Middle Ages, which I don't know, has war game. I thought it was a war game.
That's another one of those things where if it's not a war game, I don't care. It was produced by SPI. I think it's a Dunnigan design. Am I going to call Jim Dunnigan up and tell him, this thing you released in 1980 is not really a war game? Come on.
Well, you got a hotline like that, Dave? People call you and give you grief? Because I'm sure. I'm not on BGG a lot these days. I don't know if you are, but I'm sure when one of your games comes out, especially the Undaunted series, man, you get shellacked.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Thick skin on Undaunted.
Really?
The number, well, yeah. I mean, I won't devolve into this too much. The number one thing is the outrage about it having, black soldiers on the cover, and then the number two thing is it's not a war game. Yeah, I mean,
cutting the tops of their hats off too.
Right? Yes. Oh no. That is the number one.
Was my
the
favorite.
The outrage over the fact that the counters are intentionally have bleed on them is just. Yeah. You can count on that popping up on the War Games Facebook, page maybe once every 2-3 weeks. It'll just
refunds were demanded.
Yeah. But it's funny because I did see a thread at one point. I think when your first Undaunted came out, Normandy.
Yeah.
And man, people were just throwing trash out. This is not a war game. I
have a feeling that's the same half dozen people. To be honest,
it's a really
time after time after time, and you just kind of every once in a while you sneak up behind them and poke them, and they're and they go bananas because you cut the tops of the soldiers' heads off again.
You know what? This is the one thing I can say that's objectively true about Undaunted is a lot of parents have played it with a lot of their kids, and hey, if it's even if it's not a war game, I bet you a lot of those kids grow up to be war gamers, right? Well, these are wargaming parents playing with their kids, so
sure,
whatever you want to call it.
Well, am I wrong to say, how can you say it's not a war game if you have soldiers on it, for God's sake?
I mean, people just have their notions about what a war game, and there is no right or wrong. It's all personal, right?
Well, hold on, Artie's giving me the look.
There isn't a review board, right? That makes these decisions to say your game does not qualify as a war game because here's why. And if there was, people would laugh at that. It would because it's a silly idea. I think honestly that there's a couple reasons why we keep having this discussion, and one of them is that there are a small number, I believe, a relatively small number of argumentative people who don't have anything else to do. I would like to suggest that you could come over to my house and lay some tile in our kitchen. If you don't have anything better to do, please come on by.
If they're not Italian, they're not going to lay good tiles. But anyway.
Well, this Spanish tile actually, so Spanish qualifies as well. But another is that people just want to be argumentative, or they want to provoke the argumentative people. Other than that, I think most people are not particularly invested in this particular type of question. I think we enjoy the kind of games we enjoy, and I'm a hex counter guy. I mean, that's what I like to play. But who cares if somebody likes U-Boat, for example? I knew U-Boat was going to come up. There you go.
There it is.
And tonight was the night I was going to be prepared to say that U-Boat is an example of a Euro game with wargaming elements.
So therefore, it's a war game.
Sure, maybe. I have always said it's not, but I've also followed that immediately with, but who cares what I say?
No. I care what you say because I'm here to learn, man.
Well, right. But what I'm suggesting is that I have my opinion, and David has his opinion, and Volko has his opinion, and we all have our opinions. And I don't think anybody has the right answer because it's very difficult to actually pin this down. Right.
Well, I'll tell you, Volko doesn't have no answer because he ain't on the show, so screw him.
Well, he's in the comments though, but it doesn't matter. I mean, the point is that your opinion is just as good as mine. So the folks who voted for U-Boat, their opinion is just as good as mine. I might laugh at them, but I mean, that's my prerogative as a content creator. I gotta get the hits going.
I want to play devil's advocate here on U-Boat. Okay, yeah, sure, it doesn't have a map, and the map thing was a fiasco in terms of whatever. Yeah, okay. So, but let's start with the name of the game, U-Boat. Okay, that says something about war, doesn't it? Yes, it does.
Sure.
So it's war themed game.
It is, sure. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. I mean, the problem there was bigger than U-Boat specifically. U-Boat was just the example. U-Boat was not the problem. It was the process that was the problem. And a U-Boat just happened to be a convenient punching bag. And it helps that it's been a very successful game, right? That we are not punching down when we make fun of U-Boat for not being a war game.
No.
Because they're swimming in their swimming pools full of money too.
I mean, I think that for what it's worth, I think that the problem mostly lies when you have games that would not be considered classic type war games that become very popular that have a war theme. So U-Boat's an example. The amazing game Blitzkrieg by Paolo Mori is an example, right? I think it was up for BGG War Game of the Year. Paolo is one of my favorite designers in the world. I wouldn't consider it a war game, but I mean, the reason it was categorized that way is because it has a war theme and it's super popular, and so people are going to vote for it as a war game. I did want to pull a thread though, Dan, because you had asked for examples of war game mechanisms that have gone into the world of Euro games. And if we accept that the CDG was born out of games that we all agree are war games, and I think we do, that's a mechanism that certainly has made its way into the Euro game world. So if you look at like Watergate, which is a political game, historical game, whatever you want to call it, but people would largely think of it as like a Euro style game or whatever. That's the CDG. I mean, it's 100% card driven game. So I would say that's the mechanism that originated in what we think of as war games that has crossed over.
Didn't Paolo Mori do that game in Italia's? My God, where you have cards and everybody's got the same cards.
Is it Libertalia?
Libertalia, yeah.
Yeah.
I love that game, man.
Yeah, he's awesome. He's a great guy. Great guy.
I mean, you look at Blitzkrieg, and somebody sent me a copy of Blitzkrieg, so I've just gotten it into my hands relatively recently, and I haven't looked at it that closely. Where else do you put it? I don't think it neatly fits anywhere else. I mean, maybe it doesn't. It's not a traditional war game, certainly.
What are the mechanics? What are the mechanics in Blitzkrieg?
There are a bunch of tracks that you move pieces up and down tracks. Yeah. That's the mechanic. I mean, that's the to the extent that I understand the game.
You're pulling shits out of a bag for one thing.
And would you call it a worker placement mechanics on that?
No, I wouldn't call it. I'd call it. So here's the thing. Back to the worker placement thing. So when you start like really deconstructing what is and isn't a worker placement, it has so much overlap with things like action selection or whatever that it becomes sort of irrelevantly blurred, right? You have a limited supply of things, and you get to choose one of those things to take an action with. You can call that action selection. You can call that, in this card, hand management. But in this case, you have a handful of tiles, and you get to pick one, place it, take an action.
Okay, so David, have you ever played Le Havre?
No, I know it. I haven't played it.
Okay, so you gotta build up your resources,
right? Yep.
And you gotta buy stuff.
Yep.
Same thing as in Blitzkrieg.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean,
you gotta build your resources. You gotta have a strong.
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So what's the difference, man? One is less detailed than the other. Le Havre is more detailed. Okay, so you gotta buy fish, this, and that, but you gotta buy bigger boats to get your bigger plant to do this to win the game. So Blitzkrieg.
It just doesn't fit. It just doesn't, in my mind, it just doesn't fit neatly anywhere, right? But I love it. It's one of my favorite games.
I
love it. Blitzkrieg.
Oh, it's Blitzkrieg. Okay, yeah. You have the Japanese expansion?
I do.
I should say Nippon.
Let me tell you how much I like. This is a funny little aside for people that are watching that haven't heard of Blitzkrieg, how good it is. In 2019, I think is the year it came out, I had recently moved here from the UK, and I was going back to Germany to go to Essen Spiel, right? And I just got Blitzkrieg in the mail. It had just shipped from PSE. PSE is a publisher. The Kickstarter did. So I just got it in the mail like the day or two before I left for Spiel. I took Blitzkrieg with me. It's the only game I took with me to Spiel. And I remember I took it into the show one day, and I had about 4 or 5 hours where I didn't need to meet with any publishers or anything. And I grabbed a couple of people, and I played 11 games straight of Blitzkrieg.
11?
So if someone saying, because you can play it literally in 15, 20 minutes, right? So it was by far the most played game at Spiel that year for me, and I took it with me. I didn't get it from the convention. So that's the irony of that.
You ever meet Paolo Mori?
I've never met him in person. He and I have collaborated on something that's with the publisher now.
Could you speak about it, or is this?
No.
I knew it.
Not right now. No.
How come you always do this on the show that I'm on? Hey,
you get in trouble.
So Doug is asking about Junta, which is I think in print again nowadays, and it's kind of a classic. It was originally published by West End Games, as I recall, which at the time were publishing war games. I'm not sure that's what they were best known for. There you go. That's the game we're talking about. That's one of the many editions of it. There's a million different editions of Junta at this point. It's said to be fun. I've never played it, but I mean, it's a game that seamlessly fit into West End's catalog at the time because we didn't care that much, right alongside the Star Wars RPG.
So do you know the game well, Artie?
Not well, no, I've never played it.
What are the mechanics involved in Junta?
I have no idea, but does it matter? I mean, I know what the theme is. It's you're the dictator or trying to become the dictator of a small banana republic. Is that not enough? I mean, is that a war game? I mean,
you know what? It's more of a coin game, probably with that in mind. It's more political, no?
I mean, the theme, sure, I suppose. I know there's cards and I know there's pieces you move around on a board. I mean, other than that, I've never played it. So, area control would make sense based on the kind of game that it seems to be. What the point I'm trying to make is you gotta, if you're saying there's a hard line somewhere, or even a not that hard of a line somewhere between war games and other types of games, whether it's Euros or Ameritrash games or whatever. And I still don't know what the hell an Ameritrash game is, other than it's got a bunch of little pieces. You're going to find examples. And as soon as you find the first example, you'll think of a whole bunch more of a game that doesn't fit where you thought it was going to fit based on the definition that you just came up with. We can say Twilight Struggle is or is not a war game. Okay, take it as a given that it's on one side of the divide or another. Okay, well, we have Twilight Struggle. Okay, it's about area control, and area control gives you victory points, and then there's a timing element. There's other games like that, right? You know, coin games.
The subject is Cold War, for God's sake.
Well,
it's right there.
Okay, but like I said, that's one of the things that you could say. This is what makes it a war game versus not a war game. Okay, let's take that as the example. That it simulates a conflict of some kind. Doesn't have to necessarily be a shooting war, but by saying that the Cold War, which is not a direct shooting war between the two sides. There are proxy wars that occur, but those are proxy wars, right? Those are very de-emphasized for what, in my opinion, in Twilight Struggle, by the way. We're making a decision that says, okay, so other things called war, like the war on terror, that's a war game now. The war on drugs, that's a war game now. The war on the village people, is that a war game?
No,
I mean, I don't know
what you're saying. I
so
see what you're saying.
Wherever you draw the line, whether this specific title is on one side of the divide or the other, you're going to find other examples that you're not going to be comfortable with placing either on one side or the other, depending on the rule that you just created to decide the Twilight Struggle was or wasn't a war game.
And look, if Mike was talking about Junta before, area control, taking over the bank, hotel, radio station, etc. You know what that is? That's guerrilla warfare.
Okay.
Because the first thing you do is you cut off all the heads of the people in power, right? Yeah, throw them away, and then you take over the radio station. Guerrilla warfare.
Okay. Games about student protests, at least one of which is, a game I cannot give you the name of because it contains an F-bomb in the title, designed by one Mr. Jim Dunnigan in the early 70s. Game about student protests, I think at Columbia, if I'm recalling correctly.
Well, there's I'm not going to say a mechanic, but there's a faction of the only coin game I've ever played, Cuba Libre, that is student protest, and it's in a coin game. Am I making any sense? Am I?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, there is a sense in which it's a conflict. So where do you figure
non-violent faction in Gandhi, right?
Yeah, you have two non-violent factions in Gandhi.
Yeah, but who wants to play Gandhi? Come on.
I do.
That's probably. I mean, I love All Bridges Burning. It's probably my personal, or Liberty or Death. But I mean, just the fact that it provides that opportunity to explore that is super interesting.
Okay, so I think I finally understood what you mean by a war game, Artie. So you know what?
I'm not trying to give you the definition of a war game.
I just illuminated something. It's a milestone in my life right now, what just happened. Now, Artie, I think the definition of a war game in 1970s in the Webster Dictionary is probably not the same in the two. What year are we now? 1991? What year? Whatever. It's not the same definition because people like David Thompson and Mark Herman and Volko, who I don't know if Volko thinks coin games are war games, if he says it's a war game. But I'm just saying, I think it's changed now, man. I think a war game now, because of the Davids, because of the Mark Hermans, because of the Volkos, has completely changed. So that's prehistory, man.
So from a marketing space perspective, I think that's absolutely right. I think that there are, whether we call it some specific game a war game or not, it has war game things in it, and there is some level of appeal to war gamers, and yet some other people who are not war gamers don't consider themselves war gamers and wouldn't really want to play a war game are playing it right now and enjoying it. That is a thing that we didn't used to see as much for quite a while. Now, again, you go back to the 70s and you think about, I got a book somewhere, and I'm not going to stand up and grab it. A book called Fantasy Wargaming. Is there a war game in that book? Absolutely not. It's a role-playing game. it was called fantasy wargaming for the first several years of its existence.
But what about the combat? The combat involved?
There's a combat system, but there's a combat system in every role. Not every, that's true. There are a few exceptions where there isn't a combat system, but by and large, role-playing games have combat systems too, right? Remember that role-playing games came from war games.
That's right.
More from miniatures than hex encounter games, but still, what's the difference?
I know we're going a little bit off topic here, but it's the same thing. Who the first RPG was it Gary Gygax?
Well, it's more complicated than that. There's a book called Playing at the World by John Peterson that I recommend if you're interested in the history of early RPGs, especially D&D. But D&D was the first commercially available role-playing game. So there were things that were around at the time that if they were being played in 1984 instead of 1974, would unquestionably have been called RPGs, even though they used miniatures. And yet they were around in like 1969. So,
and was Guy Gax a war gamer?
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah, chainmail, right? I mean, isn't that
but also several. I mean, there's a Avalon Hills Alexander is his game. He did a number of things through various publishers. That's the only thing I could think of from Avalon Hill that he did. But they through Guidon Games, they did a couple of things, and there's a game called Don't Give Up the Ship, which I think is a naval game of some kind. That I couldn't tell you whether it's miniatures or I think it's miniatures, to be honest. That's a guy got Gygax's design on it. So yeah, he came out of wargaming, right? He played, by his own admission, Avalon Hills, Gettysburg, and Waterloo till the pieces literally disintegrated.
Okay, and you said Alexander, you just made me think of DVG's Rommel. Now Rommel, the mechanics in there, the point is to get supplies. That's if you have no supplies, you're gonna die, and that's the reality of what Rommel had in the desert. Now, would you consider that a war game? Sure. I don't even know why I'm saying that, but.
Here's another thing, and then I'll let David talk about this because he's a better position to discuss this than me. Whenever you look at any kind of game, whether it's a war game or whatever, right? It has a topic, and then it has mechanics. The topic could be a war or an epistolary, or Edwardian romance or whatever it is, right? But through the mechanics, the designer is trying to tell you, the player, something about the topic or the theme. And in the case of a game like presumably Field Commander Rommel or even OCS or whatever, the designer is trying to tell us certain things about what was going on in that historical situation, and he's emphasizing they can emphasize the logistics of it, they can emphasize the command and control of it, and they have a whole bunch of different tools that can be used to emphasize and de-emphasize the things that the designer wants to emphasize and de-emphasize. Maybe the designer doesn't care about logistics at all and just leaves it out. That's a design decision that the designer has made to leave it out because he or she doesn't want to deal with it or finds it uninteresting or just doesn't think it's particularly important at whatever scale the game is at.
MMP, since you are more of an authority on MMP, does MMP have in any of their games that you've played, any Euro-type mechanics?
There's enough MMP games that I haven't played that I don't feel comfortable giving you a definitive answer. However, there are things like King Philip's War and maybe even Kingdom of Heaven that I think are less war. I mean, I would call them war games, but they're a little less war games than maybe some of the other games. Maybe Lincoln. Their game Lincoln, which I believe is that the Martin Wallace Lincoln. I don't think
the Worthington one.
No, that's you're talking about the Worthington one. There's a game called Lincoln's War. That's the MMP game that I'm thinking of, and that's a point-to-point type thing. But no, I don't think MMP particularly does. But certainly GMT's got tons of stuff with Euro-style mechanics. Compass has tons of stuff with Euro-style mechanics.
There's an interesting question here by Nathaniel. David, let me ask David, are War Chest and Dire Alliances war games, and what would it take to make them war games? That's interesting. What would it take to make those war games war games?
Yeah, I mean, so I have a very personal opinion on war games, right? So I think, for me, in my mind, I'm not saying this is what other people should think, but I think of war games primarily as historical war games, right? I don't want to debate whether there's sci-fi war games and fantasy war games. Yes, there are. But when I think of a war game, I think of a historical war game. That's the context I use. So I would say they're not. Now, mechanically, Dire Alliance, so people probably don't know what either of those two games are. So War Chest is I would define it as an abstract bag builder, sort of like, imagine if you had chess and then you made it this sort of bag builder with each piece having unique powers, right? And then Dire Alliance is a skirmish battle game. The specific one that we created is called Dire Alliance Horror. So it's a skirmish battle game, deck building driven with like horror creatures. Both of these are designed by the same guy I worked with on Undaunted, and they share some game mechanism DNA. So War Chest, it's funny because even in War Chest, AEG, who's the publisher, added some historical setups where it leverages like the key pieces that are in it to try to evoke some history. I think that's fine, but to me, it's not a war game unless the war part to include, as already mentioned earlier, and this is very important to me, geographic impact, right? So
scale.
Well, scale, but actual geography. Even if it's fictitious geography should matter. And in War Chest, there's no geography. It's just a hex grid. There's no sense of geography. So that's one thing that it would need to try to model something real, quote unquote real. And then Dire Alliance I would say is closer to it. So if you allow like fantasy and sci-fi into your war game definition, then I would say it's probably a war game. You could expand it into that.
Wow, that's.
I mean, my tastes are in alignment with that definition of. I feel like it has to try to be simulating something, presumably something historical, but it could be fictional history too. Jeff Beeler asks, "This is a really good example. Circus Maximus, Avalon Hill, Circus Maximus, which I think thematically is not a war game. I mean, you can call it a melee combat game if you want with chariots, I suppose." But it totally uses war game mechanics that were standard at the time that it was created, which I think that was from Avalon Hill. It might have been from Battleline originally.
Going back to the
Angola. That's a great example. I should have thought of that.
Now,
Angola is probably the least traditional war game that MMP has published.
And that's MMP publishing it now, man. You can't say Grognard without having MMP in the same sentence, man.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, there's other examples too. MMP just is one of the larger names, but I mean, certainly there are other publishers that are maybe smaller that stick just as closely to traditional Hex Encounter stuff. Revolution Games, Legion War Games,
Grognard Simulations.
Well, yeah, but they're two guys in a garage too. So, and they're the fiddliest of the fiddly Hex Encounter things too.
Dave, we got
Ragnar Brothers. Yeah, that's true. Angola was originally published by Ragnar Brothers.
David, we got 10 minutes left, and I wanted to talk about your the Valiant, Defense series, Pavlov's House. Now you got 3 scales in that game, right? You got tactical, you got operational, and you got strategic. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would call it so. I call a counter equals 8 individual person. I call that skirmish personally.
Okay,
right. The exterior of the house, you have small groups attacking. I would say that's tactical. So I would define it as skirmish, tactical, operational.
What's the Euro mechanics involved in that?
There's a lot of Euro. So there are 2 parts to Pavlov's House mechanically. You're playing 2 distinct phases as the solo player. You're playing one side where you're defending the house, and that, I would say that's a war game. You're controlling shits, you're rolling dice for combat, blah blah blah. That's very war gamey. The other half is very Euro gamey. You're again, we go back to this distinction, and this was intentional. You have the where you're defending it with individual guys. You choose the action. There's nothing limiting that. You can choose any action that your guy can take in the situation he's in. You make a choice. You roll dice to see the outcome. On the flip side, you have the operational level where it's constrained by a deck of cards. That's your input randomness. So it's a completely different type of randomness, very much more Euro as far as like stereotyping it.
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about resource management. Again, very Euro. If you were to classify things, it was very, and again, that distinction was intentional because I wanted it to feel very different.
Did you get any flack on that?
Nope. I have never had a single. I mean, you'll every once in a while somebody will make a comment about it, but I have been surprised at how well it's been received by the solitaire wargaming community is a niche within a niche, right? And so it's a special breed of people that I think in some ways have a broader taste, like a broader acceptance, maybe. So, but to answer your question, I've never gotten any pushback on it. It's been received really well.
And what Castle Litter? What are the Euro mechanics in there?
So Castle Litter doesn't have a lot. Castle Litter is the tactical or the skirmish portion of Pavlov's House, sort of blown up on steroids a little bit. So there is the only resource management you're doing is you're managing essentially ammunition for suppression. You're suppressing attackers with ammunition, so you're managing that. But it's mostly the skirmish part, so it's closer to a war game, quote unquote, if you will.
Now, this one being a war game for sure, the postman in soldier's uniform. Now, I'm assuming you don't have many Euro game mechanics in that game.
No, I mean, so all of these solitaire games, I would say, are more hybrid than anything, right? Because they do especially in the AI, the enemy AI system is akin to, I don't know what it would be like. You'll find it in any sort of something like a pandemic, right? You flip a card, you do the AI, but that straddles both worlds. So you have that. You do have some resource management again, and in managing suppression, managing ammunition, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, your decisions are mostly, again, output random. So I choose a list of options available to me. But having said that, you're managing your people. There's a lot of action efficiency management, right? Which again you would traditionally call more of a Euro kind of thing.
Would you call Postman would you call that a war game?
I would, yeah, for sure. I would call them all war games. Yeah, I would categorize it.
And what's your new one called? I'm sorry, I forgot the title.
The one that's coming out in December, Lanzareth Ridge. So that's a very small battle, first day of the Battle of the Bulge.
So how are you going to Euro game mechanic that?
So it's interesting. That has it's from the same line of games, right? So it shares a lot of the same mechanisms as the other ones. Probably the most interesting thing, and this isn't Euro or war game or whatever that's different, is I needed a really good, interesting, elegant way to model weapon effective range, because there was a good breadth of what the defenders were using. And I wanted to model that in an easy way, and you went to this dice graduation system, right? So like if you're firing some short-range weapon, it only has a D6, so it literally can't fire anything beyond that. And so, not that that's Euro or war game or whatever, but I think that was probably the most interesting mechanism that came out of that design, new to the system.
And what about a sniper? I haven't looked at sniper.
Sniper Elite.
I'm sorry, Sniper Elite.
Yeah. Sniper Elite's different from anything I've ever done. It's a hidden movement game, right? So if people are familiar with games like Spectre Ops or Fury of Dracula or Scotland Yard, games like that, it fits into that niche of what's called hidden movement games.
So there's the Euro idea right there.
Yeah, and it has at its core this bag manipulation or bag building system where you're doing things specifically to manipulate this bag of tokens, and that's what controls the accuracy of your sniper shot.
Artie, sorry, I have a big mouth. I took over here. Go ahead.
It's okay. What's the question?
What question?
You're asking me.
No, you have a question.
I have a question?
Yes, I'm sure.
I mean, I could come up with a question. Well, okay, so first of all, I one of the things that I think that I'll point out that I think David mentioned that that maybe solitaire gamers, like dedicated solo war gamers, have traditionally had a little more open definition of what is a war game, and that's probably due to the history of dedicated solitaire war games, which generally speaking, have not been Hex Encounter affairs, because Hex Encounter, I mean, one of the appeals to me of Hex Encounter is that you have a whole hex grid that gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of maneuver, right? Well, that's the kind of thing that you maybe want to control a little more tightly in a solitaire game. So you end up going with a thing like a point-to-point map, where you maybe don't have 6 different places you can go from any given space on the board. Maybe you have a smaller number, or maybe you have some more specialized arrangement of board spaces, for example. But something like, I mean, there's that. There were some early S&T solitaire designs, that relatively early anyway, that I think didn't fit the Hex Encounter mold. Certainly something like I think what a lot of people would consider an archetypical solitaire war game in B-17 Queen of the Skies has, I mean, there's like random tables, but unless you like say that that's the same mechanism as a CRT, and maybe you do, but there's like not really traditionally wargamer elements in there other than the theme, the fact that the theme is you're flying the B-17, and there are random die rolls to determine what happens next, and a specific, you know, a highly structured sequence of play. But that's as wargame as it gets, really. I mean, there's nothing else there to call it a wargame other than the theme and the sort of approach. So I mean, games. I have not seen anybody complain about, you know, Pavlov's House is not a war game either. No, and I think David is right in saying that it's just because it's a solitaire game. I think those people are just a little more used to games that maybe don't fit the traditional Hex Encounter Groundyard mold.
Yeah, I'm just it's amazing now, and it's funny when I thought about that thing, the definition of a war game in 1970 and the definition of a war game now completely changes, and that's because of the Euro mechanics involved. And also on their side, someone had said here on the chat that what I forget, diplomacy.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly it's a borderline game. I'll certainly agree with that statement. I've never considered diplomacy a war game, but because it's a game about negotiation. I mean, the rules to diplomacy fit on an index card, and everything else that happens in diplomacy is negotiations between the players. It is a social game. It's almost a party game for wargamers, I suppose. In the same sense, I suppose, a slightly different sense than like Captain Sonar is a party game for wargamers.
I don't even know Captain Sonar.
Oh,
it's good.
Go find Russell.
It's really good.
Find yourself some video. There's video on Captain Sonar. It's an absolute riot.
It's fun. If you got 8 people, that's what you should be playing.
Yeah, you want a lot of people. There's I think the other version, which is just called Sonar, I think accommodates like 4 people. But you do need a certain amount of players for it. But that's totally what it is. It's a party game for wargamers.
And if you're not a wargamer, you think my girlfriend would get into that?
Captain Sonar? Maybe she would, actually. Because it's about as much of a war game as Battleship is.
Yeah, okay.
So think of it as like 8 people playing Battleship, except it's like real time and there's no turns and everyone is shouting.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you got to find video on it. It's a riot.
You know, there's a channel called, what is it? The Beer and Board Games, where these guys get drunk and play board games. You never seen that?
No. Why do I need to watch that on YouTube?
I live that every night.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome to the dream.
Well, look, guys, time is up. This was David. Thank you so much, man.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me.
So much fun, you know. Artie, thanks again for the lessons.
Next week, we are at my place, and the subject I have picked up is block war games.
Ooh.
So we can talk about block war games.
Okay. Well, again, gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to do my famous outro, and please stick around for 2 minutes. It will say bye-bye and send money to me or something, okay?
Thanks, everybody.
I'm handsome and you're ugly and you know it. I'm handsome and you're ugly and you know it. I wake up in the morning and I look into the mirror. I'm handsome and you're ugly.